All right, y'all. Today I have a guest, and we're going to be talking about theonomy. Before we get into the topic itself, though, don't forget to like, subscribe, press the bell button, all the usual YouTube things. And now I welcome my friend, Jason Farley. Hey, Jason.
Good to see you.
Yeah, man. How do you like my nifty little studio with like the overlay and everything?
It's pretty amazing. I was just thinking that it makes you look really professional. And you spend most of your life seeming so professional, so that works out great.
You have out-professionaled me in one arena, and that is having a sweet microphone.
Yeah, it's
well done.
Yeah. It's my first time using it. So
yeah, okay, all right. So don't blow it now. All right, so we're going to talk about theonomy, and you're a school teacher and a writer and an artiste.
I am. That's true. I'm a writer, screenwriter, comedy writer, written some nonfiction, poetry, so kind of writer of all the things, and then have taught quite a bit. Have a screenwriting class coming up in January, and but then really for a living, I work for Lore TV as a screenwriter, comedy writer, and then a liaison between artists and the business people so that they don't have to ever talk to each other.
Right. Heaven forbid.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I suppose I should be talking to a lawyer or a great church leader, but I guess I'll just be satisfied talking to some TV writer about theonomy. I thought of you first when I was faced with a question from Rafael D. Yeah, so he asked a question that I decided I'm not going to ask his question. I'm going to ask the question I want to ask. Inspired by him. I think he'll be satisfied with this. So what Rafael actually asked was, where is the new generation of high quality theonomists? What I'm actually going to ask you is, and I want you to answer this monosyllabically, then we'll define what theonomy is. Then we'll come back to your answer. Is that cool?
That sounds good.
All right. So the question is theonomy dead?
Yes.
Okay. Qualified yes. All right.
Qualified yes.
That, what is theonomy? Why? Because somebody is watching this video who clicked on it for bad reasons and has no idea what theonomy is. I'm glad that person's here.
Yeah.
So let's tell this guy what theonomy is.
I mean, and this is where I think this is why it's a qualified yes, because it depends on how you end up defining it. Because there's theonomy that was a part of the Reconstructionist movement, and that is the sense in which I think that theonomy is dead as a movement. As a philosophical concept, it's an inescapable philosophical concept in terms of theonomy being that there is a God behind the legal system, God behind the system of laws in a culture, in a society, and that's an inescapable concept. There is always a God of the system. So the question of which God of the system is actually the question when talking about theonomy as a philosophical concept.
So what you're saying is that you're willing to say theonomy is dead if we're talking about a movement.
Yes.
Then theonomy as is it true or not? It would be a separate question.
Separate question altogether. Yeah. And that's where getting into the what is it that we're talking about? Which of the things we're talking about then is important.
And I think Rafael D is talking about the movement, right? He wants to know where the great writers have gone. So we're talking about a movement, but let's actually talk about it as truth first.
Okay.
So what is theonomy? And I think we could actually define it in a few different ways. And theonomy is definitely one of the, particularly because it's beloved by the Reformed. Ink could be spilled just on definitions, like just page after page, and resulting shortly after the ink being spilled, we'd have blood spilled.
Right, because in a Christian sense, the question of theonomy is just, is there is there an ultimate judge? Is there an ultimate judge giving ultimate judgments? And are we supposed to match up our judgments on earth with his ultimate judgments, right? That is a broad philosophical concept. That that question is a theonomic question. So is Jesus King of Kings, Lord of Lords, who judges from his great white throne? And as Christians, we say, well, yes, of course. Right? That's not up for debate. And then the theonomy question is one of our jobs as we mature as Christians, as society, are we supposed to be taking our judgments and aligning them with his ultimate judgments, right? Is the prayer on earth as it is in heaven also applicable to the judges and juries and legal system of the world? And that's why, and that's why Reformed people have liked it so much, because they say, well, yeah, of course, all of the world is supposed to be being conformed to Christ in all of his offices, prophet, priest, king. So and you've got a lot of great thinkers that I don't even know how old the word theonomy is. It's probably a fairly new word. The concept goes all the way back.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, and like so many things, when was so and so, was Aquinas talking about the concept yay or nay, and it's so hard not to be anachronistic about it. Yeah. But one of the great virtues of theonomy is that it seeks to be directly biblical.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Because Aquinas I think is a good example of we do this. Is he a natural law? Does he believe in natural law? And say, well, yeah, of course, he's a natural law philosopher. Does anything that we call natural law therefore stem from Thomas Aquinas?
Right.
Say, right. Well, no, because he was actually a careful philosopher and a careful theologian who defined his terms carefully. And so when he's talking natural law, he has predefined it. He's told us what it is and what it does and what it doesn't do, and and all of that. And so now you've got all sorts of people that are like, well, I'm a natural law philosopher like Thomas Aquinas. And then their description of natural law and Thomas Aquinas's descriptions of natural law are incompatible, but they're both using the same term. And I think theonomy is often used in that same sort of way. Is John Calvin a theonomist? Does he want the judgments of the legal judgments of Geneva, for example, where he lived, to come in line with God's judgments that God is making through Christ as the ruler? Well, yes, absolutely. Does everything a theonomist says now therefore line up with what Calvin believed? Well, no, that's
right.
That doesn't.
And like so many labels. I mean, you mentioned, okay, well, Aquinas is a careful philosopher,
right?
And labels, of course, the convenience of them is that they paint with such a broad brush. But like if I hear a definition of theonomy, I say, oh yeah, I'm a theonomist,
right?
But I say that knowing that anyone who trumpets that they're a theonomist would not qualify.
Right. Yeah. So, and I mentioned this to you just a minute ago, that I find myself running in packs of theonomists often, and then people are like, "So you're a Reconstructionist?" I'm like, "No, I'm not."
Okay, so what's a Reconstructionist?
Are you a theonomist? He's like, "No, I'm not," because I think I know what you mean.
Right.
It's a little bit like saying, "Hey, are you a conservative?" Say, I mean,
what are you trying to conserve?
Yeah, it depends on, like, are you talking like modern conservatism that is actually trying to conserve the democratic policies of the 90s? Like, right. I'm not that conservative.
Yeah, when we're talking, Rush Dooney, when we're talking, who is a great man and a great writer, and we're talking about other, very helpful authors, and then, but also the context and place and time that they were in through the 70s and the 80s. Most of theonomy and theonomic thought really focuses on civil society.
Yeah.
It's, you know, it's a civic theology, which doesn't seem to naturally be at the core of an optimistic kingdom building theology necessarily, right? It almost seems like it's putting the cart before the horse.
Yeah, and I think that is why, you know, when you say what happened to the Reconstructionist movement, I think what happened is the things that they became known for and popular for and famous for were maybe not even the things at the heart of their own theology, but they were the things that got them attention. We are people that will gravitate towards the things that are being subsidized, right? Their attention was being subsidized by questions like, does a firing squad count as stoning? Because it's very small rocks at very high rates of speed, right? And everybody's like, that's the weirdest debate. And so then everybody goes and they look at it, and they get a lot, and those aspects of the movement are subsidized. And this is just looking at this is the human nature things. Those aspects of the movement are subsidized by attention, and so you get more of those.
Right.
And so even if those things aren't necessarily at the heart of their own thought and movement, those are the things they end up spending a lot of time.
And those are definitely about. Like the Bonson debates that still survive on YouTube, right? From the 80s. Right. You know, it was that sort of thing, because it was the sort of thing that fascinated the Christians who really, like, you know, it's you and I exist in a little corner of Christendom that is fluffing a lot of feathers. No, it's unsettling a lot of people because it's putting down cultural roots. And there are associations in our little corner of Christendom with theonomy, with Reconstruction, and it can get a little cloudy sometimes. But I think it's fair to make those associations, particularly
100%.
Historically.
And I think it's probably unfair of me even to say, when somebody says, "Hey, are you a theonomist? Are you a Reconstructionist?" to say no so vehemently when I hang out with some of them,
right?
You know,
and when, like, you know, I would say, you know, I guess I would stand with Aquinas or Calvin and say, you know, that a king does not sin if he makes this exact law straight out of Scripture,
right? Yeah.
But that's not what most theonomists would say theonomy is. But, you know, but here we are, very comfortable, you know, with the idea of, we're building a society where men who cheat on their wives will be killed. That's fine.
I'm totally comfortable with that if we get to that legal structure in a legal way. And this is where I think that often the Reconstructionists and the theonomists as a movement went wrong, is they've thought too much in Enlightenment terms of what is the ideal, right? And how do we impose the ideal onto society?
Not only are those Enlightenment terms, but embarrassingly, I think for most people, you know, who associated with the Reconstruction movement, very Latin, not particularly Germanic or Anglo-Saxon.
No,
I mean, it's the Romans and the Greeks who liked to think of ideals, make laws platonically. This is why there's so much corruption in the remains of the Spanish and Portuguese empires. That's why there's so much corruption in Italy
and in New Orleans.
You know, where has common law gone? Instead of thinking of biblical law as the fruit of a people who then create a common law, there is sort of this, it's the cart before the horse thing.
And so I think there's often a revolutionary mindset that wants to impose good legal structures illegally, and that is what makes me that's where and sometimes they're just not even talking practical, right? They're just talking, and so they're just saying it ought not to be this way.
That's a nice thing about that was a nice thing about the theonomy of the 70s and 80s. Was that it was pure theory.
Pure theory,
And now you and I actually live. We live in a place where we could see, maybe our grandkids would actually have an opportunity.
Right. And it's so here is an example of why I think that the actual movement died, is because it didn't know how to live within history, right? It didn't know how to live. It didn't know how its theories lived within history. So this is a really great book. Let's see, how do I do this? King Alfred and Boethius, right? By F. Payne. And it is an analysis of the Old English version of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, which was translated by King Alfred while he sat on the throne, while he was trying to develop a legal theory for the newly minted English people, or the newly united English people, right? There were seven kingdoms, 7 kings, because of external forces and a number of major military losses that destroyed royal families, gutted royal families, so that there wasn't anyone to sit on the throne. There were the 7 thrones end up united into a single throne. King Alfred wins back that throne through some wonderful providential victories. He attributes to God his victory, and then sits on the throne. He's the legal heir to one of the thrones, but ends up having all of the thrones end up submitting themselves. All of the peoples end up submitting their thrones to Alfred, or to Alfred's father. And then Alfred wins back the throne. He then says, it's my job as king to be the protector of these people, right? And to establish what does it look like for these 7 thrones to have a legal system that honors God, right? That's his job. And so he begins translating Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy into Anglo-Saxon, but he makes for his lords to be able to learn the wisdom that they are going to need to be able to judge well in their role, and anything that is difficult for them to judge is passed up to him, right? And so he is the final judicial authority, but there's lords, there's judges. Eventually a jury system is established because of Aeschylus, the Greek poet Aeschylus, right? There's all these wisdom issues that he's trying to wrestle with. And he does it by translating Boethius, who is trying to pull together the philosophical traditions of the Greeks and the Romans, and bring them into line with an Augustinian theology, right? That's what Boethius is trying to do in his book, The Consolation of Philosophy, that he writes while he's in prison. That translation, Alfred feels completely comfortable fixing and making, as he translates, he makes it more biblical by just taking parts out and replacing it with more biblical ideas, more covenantal ideas, and ideas that he's actually drawing from the Anglo-Saxon law tradition, which is a tribal law tradition. So he takes the tribal law tradition of the Anglo-Saxons, which he thinks is in some ways more biblical than some of the Greek and Roman legal traditions. And then he takes the book of Deuteronomy and adds it in to the conversation. Right? And that's how he establishes the beginning of the English common law system, is by getting legal traditions into conversation with one another and letting the Bible arbitrate the conversation. And that's how he establishes the common law system in a legal way, right? But not in a revolutionary way, not in a coercive. It's coercive because he's the civil magistrate.
Yes.
Yeah, so he can be coercive, but there's a legal coercive. There's a legal way to be coercive, and there's an illegal way to be coercive. And he's serving the Lord and wants so badly to have a legal establishment of the law that he goes out of his way and spends his life treating the law as a craft, because he's the king, and trying to come up with a legal system that is not only legal, but it's also biblical in its content, but also biblical in its system, legal system, right? So the common law tradition is a way of trying to bring not just the content of the law into line, but the actual system of the law into line with the way Exodus and Deuteronomy set up the law in the Old Testament. But he's doing it in a way that is about wisdom, right? That where he is formed as the authority into a wise man by studying things, by studying the history. And then as the authority, he can establish through the legal means a legal system that's in line. And it's rare that you get that sort of thing just in a single generation. England had the blessing that you look back and it's a blessing. At the time, I'm sure it didn't look like a blessing, but they had the blessing of 6 of their kings being killed.
Yeah, right. Well, and that the legislation, not conquest, is why Alfred is known as the Great. But I have to ask, like, what you're describing, how is that not theonomy?
It's not theonomy in terms of, well, so that's the thing. It's theonomy in the big sense, of the word, right? But what's different about it is, I think it is what the theonomic movement didn't do well was exist in a historical context,
right?
And say, what does it look like to take the next step towards?
Well, and how could it exist in a historical context? And I think your use of the word legality is worth coming back to and exploring. But really, the way theonomy gets presented is as an abstraction.
Yes,
and abstractions are abstract; they are not real; they do not exist. Theonomy, as presented by people I know, is not a thing.
Right.
Now, the Bible's a thing. The Mosaic Law is a thing. Alfred's history is a thing. History happens, and it's actually embarrassingly, it's kind of not incarnational.
No, it's not. It's Hegelian, honestly.
Oh, boom! What do you mean by that, sir?
So Hegel was an Enlightenment philosopher who believed that the ideas that exist in ideals, I guess is probably a better way to put it. He was German, and so he talked about the ideas, but he was talking about ideals in an English our word ideal comes from the word idea. It's perfect idea, and so he would call them ideas.
You recognize how poetically awkward this is, right?
I know. I'm sorry. But he believed that history is the perfect idea of things working itself into reality or into existence, from the ideal realm into existence. And history was the way that those ideas enforced, or the way that those ideas came about as something that existed within history. But it did it through a process of the presentation of one of the ideas, and then the presentation of the opposite of one of those ideas, both of which are true, and then they come into conflict with one another, and you get a new thing that is closer to the ultimate ideal, right? And then that new thing, its opposite comes into existence in opposition to it, and then those ideas then come into conflict, and a new idea begins to exist. And that is an idealism that, and he actually, what he said is there, and then what will happen is eventually the government will become powerful enough to enforce the reality of the idea through coercion, and that will be the ideal state, right? We'll worship the government because it will be the
which is why
incarnation of God.
Hegelianism is associated with totalitarian movements,
Yeah.
for a reason. And so many questions just come flooding in as you unpack that. But the first thing I'd ask is how, so are you familiar with Leibniz's thing that Voltaire made fun of it? I think it was Voltaire and Candide. He makes fun of Leibniz saying that this is the best of all possible worlds.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
How does Hegelianism and the best of all possible worlds, and like how do those interact?
Well, so Leibniz's declaration that this is the best of all possible worlds sort of comes from his take on physics, which is a weird. I mean, Leibniz was a weird dude, right? He's a mathematician trying to also do philosophy, but he does it like a mathematician would do philosophy, right? That reading Leibniz it's a hoot because it's a little bit like watching the Big Bang Theory, and the main character, whose name is it? What's his name? He's the ultra smart physicist, right? But he has no social skills, and that's like, it's like reading Leibniz is a little bit like reading that, right? Okay. He's but the because there isn't other worlds aren't possible, because there's not really, everything is just physics, everything is just moving forward in a way that it has to move forward, and you end up with this world because of physics. I think a more modern philosopher that says something similar that I think is useful to at least think about is an atheist philosopher who he wrote the Salmon at the End of the Universe, and what was the guy's name? Douglas Adams. I can't think of his famous book was
Hitchhiker's Guide
to the Galaxy. Yeah. So he has an essay in which he talks about the fine tuning of the universe, and he says that can't be an argument for the existence of God, because our universe is fine tuned in the same way that a puddle is fine tuned to the hole that that formed it, right? A puddle looks at the shape of the hole and says, "Oh my gosh, I fit here so perfectly. There must have been a creator that made this hole just for me." But the reality is, it's the hole that's forming the puddle. And so he says this universe, because it formed itself, right?
Yeah.
It seems fine-tuned from within, but it's only because it's fine-tuned to this thing that created it, or created itself.
Right. Well, it's like the argument. I mean, arguments of irreducible complexity are a little distinct from this, but people will argue for creationism by saying, like, what are the chances?
Yeah.
And they'll go into all these arguments about what the chances are. That's completely irrelevant.
Yeah. Right.
We're here.
Yeah.
Those were the chances.
And that's and when I've had those conversations with atheists, I did evangelism up on the UCSC campus, University of California, Santa Cruz, which claims to be the most liberal, the most left-leaning campus in the country. They were the first ones to establish a dorm only for homosexuals, and that sort of thing. So I did evangelism up there for 6 years, and you start talking about that, and they'll say, "Well, we're here, aren't we? So obviously, even if the chances were slim, we snuck in."
Yep.
It's like, it's the same reason people buy Powerball. They're like, "So you're saying there's a chance, right?"
Well, but it's a little different from that, because it's not buying the Powerball ticket; it's already having the millions of dollars.
Yeah, you're like, "Look, I've already got the millions of dollars, so it doesn't matter what the chances are that I win Powerball, or we won Powerball." And
well, let's go back to the Hegelian thing. And by the way, to viewers, this is what a conversation with Farley is going to be like, and I'm embracing that. So you all just put your seatbelts on. But yeah, so let's get back to the Hegelian thing, because for me, there's a direct connection. It's not that one came from the other, but it was all in the air at the time. But positivism
Mhm.
is the demonic reason that so many of our institutions are the way they are. And so there's something, this ideal, and this progressiveness, this
Right.
progression in Hegel. It does that. So you just said that theonomy, as is presented by many modern advocates, theonomy as is put out there, is Hegelian. Is it positivist? Is it progressivist? Like what about that is noxious?
I I think what it is you end up with legal theories that the only way to get to them are by illegal means.
Okay, so I'm glad you said that, because I wanted to get back to that. You talked about Alfred, and it was kind of obvious how when Alfred starts. I mean, he was a king of law,
Right. Yeah.
um, and so
It
the
was his
legality of
job.
what was that,
It was his job.
right?
But because of his Christian convictions as well as his understanding of legal theory, he also understood he doesn't have the divine right of kings to do whatever he wants. He exists in a legal environment, and he has to do what he does in a legal way, because he isn't the law is over him as well.
But how does that matter to Christians? Um, if the Bible commands that laws be a certain way, doesn't that justify revolution and replacement?
Uh, this is where I think that the questions that the Reconstructionists are asking tend to break down, or they're not aware they're not having some of these conversations. That might, I think, be it. Um, to get from here to there, so the press. Do I start with an example or do I start with a theory? That's the question. My 7 laws of teaching tell me to start with an example.
Do it.
uh, the Presbyterians believed that they had a deeper legal claim that that the Church of the British Isles was originally organized in a along the lines of the tribal governments uh, before Augustine of Canterbury arrived and brought the Roman bishops' authority to the British Isles, right? And they made that legal argument based on the way that there was actually already a church. So they looked at Bede's ecclesiastical history and the other things that Bede talks about, and said, well, there actually was already a church here before the Anglo-Saxons invaded and pushed the church to Wales and pushed the church up to the Picts, who become the Scots, right? And they said there was already a church here. How was it organized? Well, we believe it was organized along Presbyterian lines. Here's our argument for it, right? So that there's actually a church. There was a Presbyterian church here that, because of the circumstances of the attack of the Germanic people, the Anglo-Saxons, they actually pushed the English into Wales, and they pushed the Scots into Scotland, or the Picts into Scotland, and established something new. And then the Roman bishop, Bishop Gregory, sends a missionary to the Anglo-Saxons and
Right.
converts them from Canterbury. And then
We'll call them the English, and we'll call the people they pushed out the Britons.
The Britons. Yeah, they're the ones that ended up in Wales. And don't bring the fact that the Irish were called the Scots into it, because that just
no, let's not do that. Yeah.
Right. So the Picts and the Britons were already converted, or they weren't fully converted, but there were Pictish and Breton churches there. And so that the Presbyterians made the argument that there's actually a deeper, more fundamental legal claim to Presbyterianism in the British Isles than there is to the Roman bishop's authority. And there was actually a war, that when you hear like, oh, there was a war over Easter, that's really what it was. There was a war over the dating of Easter, but if we think that's what the issue was, then we've missed the point. There was a war over the dating of Easter. It took 100 years for them to figure it out. And at the end of the 100-year war over the dating of Easter between the British Christians and the English Christians, the English Christians won the war, established the Roman authority there, and then things ensued. Eventually, the French take over England and establish the Roman authority in an even deeper way for their own reasons that have to do with the multiplicity of popes at different times.
It still makes me a little mad that the Pope came out in favor of the Normans before they even invaded.
Oh yeah, no, come on, Pope. Right. So but there are legal and economic reasons and all that, and just the Normans were the best cooks. Like they had the best cookbooks.
I'm glad the English are the way they are, but one feels sympathy for. I mean, Harold Hardrada was up in Stanbridge fighting the Vikings, and like they hustled on down to get to the Normans, and like the Pope was on their side. That's very discouraging.
Super discouraging, right? But anyway, but that becomes a part of the argument of the Presbyterians,
right,
for a deeper, more fundamental Presbyterianism that they said that's a legal argument for why we should do it, right? They're also having legal arguments about whether or not the Bible should be translated into the language of the people, right? They don't just suddenly start translating. They say, hey, there's actually a tradition of translating the Bible into English that we can trace all the way back to these Anglo-Saxon missionaries, right? So they're trying to figure out, how do we exist as how do we make the argument for which is the legal tradition in canon church law. And then some of the Presbyterians try to overthrow the government, which is illegal, right? And they're thrown aside, and I think rightly so, they are removed. Right? Now, I side with them on their legal argument and against them on their decision to overthrow the government for it, because they still had legal means by which they could have continued their appeal.
So hold on a second. Am I okay? So I have secretly been a cavalier all these years. Are you also, not so secretly, I guess, a cavalier?
I think the Cavaliers had the legal authority on their side at the time.
Yeah.
And because I don't think that the throne had yet broken covenant the way I think that King George III did break covenant, and lost his right to continue to claim the reign, right? Because I think there is the Declaration of Independence is explaining, we've tried all the legal ways,
right,
and you have refused to protect us. Yes. I don't think the Presbyterians had yet tried all of the legal ways. Now it's hard though, because you're like, I agree with their legal arguments.
Right, it is tough, but yeah, I myself am a Cavalier, but not a Tory. But I think this raises a very interesting point, because like part of what we think of when we picture Puritans in the negative sense, and of course like in the negative sense, what we have right now, the non-Christians on the left are today's prudes and Puritans. But in the negative image of Puritans that moderns tried to paint, and moderns who weren't Christians tried to back paint into American history, was actually taken from English history, and legitimately. So if we look at Puritan culture, once they got away, once they managed to start establishing themselves and not be defining themselves against, like always being in the negative, They come to the New World. They get to make their own thing. Eventually, they become Unitarians, but we don't
Yeah.
need to dwell on that.
No.
It wasn't all that bad. But in England, they did things like cancel Christmas.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And,
and that's where the moderns pulled that into American history.
And the canceling of Christmas, I think, is a good example of the revolutionary spirit that is, if they say there ought not to be Christmas, right? That's a moral claim. Christmas is somehow a bad idea, right? That's a moral claim. And the revolutionary mindset says, therefore, I need to figure out how to impose.
That's right.
That
because what happened with that? I mean, really, and this is where we start talking about common law now,
Yep.
And we have to think biblically and as Christians. But if there's an entire town, as happened across, there were entire towns. Everyone in the town says, "I am a Christian." Everybody in the town is baptized. Everybody in the town goes to church. Everybody in the town wants to celebrate Christmas, longs to celebrate Christmas, and men with swords and round helmets are telling them they can't.
Right. Yeah.
And that's the imposition. That's the revolution.
That's the revolution that says that that you bring about a culture from the outside in, right?
Right.
And that is, I think, the mistake that I do believe that is the mistake that many of the theonomists and Reconstructionists made. Now, I don't believe that was actually their theology.
Right.
And that's what's so tough is you can say, I know that's not true, because that's not the Puritan theology either. They know that's not true.
Yeah.
But
it's how things happen in history.
Yeah.
And we have this modern temptation where, it's, of course, people raised in the 1980s are going to, as Christian as they may be, they're still going to be infected by these modernist, progressivist, positivist ideas.
Yeah.
And they're going to take a theology like that and try to impose it instead of, focusing on faithfully living out their lives.
Right. And those two things, so and this is where it gets tough, because I think the reason we don't have that the Reconstructionist movement wasn't passed to the next generation, and I'm sure there are exceptions,
which it wasn't. You're right that it wasn't.
Many of
not
the
that
children,
it's only disappeared, but it was not passed on.
It was not passed on, and many of the children of those theologians didn't continue on. That shows that it was not something that could be imposed via love from the inside out, right? The love of it was not passed to the next generation, and that that's not an argument that any one particular position is wrong, right? That's an argument against the culture of the theonomists, of the Reconstructionists. It wasn't something that their kids said, "Oh my gosh, I love this so much, I need to run with it, I need to pass it on." And and this is where I think a lot of their they wrote tomes. They wrote theological tomes. They wrote polemical tomes. They debated. They wrote article after article after article, and they lost because they argued in a non-human or an inhuman way. Right? I don't think they argued for what they loved in the way you argue for something that you love.
This goes back to the use of the word incarnational. It's not an incarnational theology.
So one of the great theologians, and really one of the great legal minds of Reformational England, is a man that you never would think of as a legal mind, John Milton, because in the midst of the middle of his legal career, he would have ended up, the prime minister of England. His legal career was taking off. His political career was taking off. He was incredibly well spoken. He was intelligent. Everybody knew, like, this guy's going to be prime minister. The dude went blind in the middle of it, and he writes this amazing sonnet about his blindness. It's called On Blindness. Usually, he called it, I think, sonnet 73 or something like that. But
okay,
and he just says, and it's his prayer, it's a sonnet prayer saying, Lord, I thought I had been given a job by you to transform England for your kingdom. And I studied, I worked hard, I was good at my job, I was on my way up, and then here I am. I woke up one day and I couldn't see. I mean, his eyes went away. And he says, and he ends by saying, but I know that my job is to wait on the king. And whether I wait on him in the courtroom, I wait on him in the House of Lords, or I wait on him in the dark, I know it's my job to wait, but I still don't understand why you took away my eyesight. Right? It's a beautiful sonnet. Beautiful sonnet.
I think that's the sonnet that has the line, "They also serve who stand and wait."
Yep, it is. It is. They also serve who stand and wait, because he's like, that's what I'm doing. What he did with his blindness was to write the epic in the English language that most formed the English language only after the King James Bible, and that actually convinced the rest of the world that republicanism, which was what he had spent his time arguing for, it's what introduced the rest of the world to a republican form of government.
So we're moving directly into what I wanted to talk about next, of course. Right? But so if we have any hopes, well, we're both professionals here. Come on. Now, if we have any hope of finishing in an hour, which we don't have to do,
no, we don't.
We should talk about, like, what should we be doing? And so now you're opening up this idea that, so without using words like postmillennialism or Reconstruction, like, you are, it seems, by example, suggesting that we can build the kingdom by building culture.
Yeah,
and that's how we should do it.
I think we build the kingdom by building the art, by creating the artifacts of culture. I don't think we have access to culture in any significant way. I don't think we can build culture. Okay. I think our job is to walk with
artifacts of culture
and build the art and create the artifacts of culture, and then trust it all to God. Because I do think the Reconstructionists tried to build culture, and they didn't realize that God didn't give them hammers and nails, right? Because I don't think God.
Because what you're saying is that, culture, basically we go around reifying things that are not reses, right? So culture ain't a thing. Yeah. Your family is, and all these artifacts of culture. But we are, like, there are many Christians in our circles who go around saying abstract things about kingdom building when there is. No, they're not actually making, and that's why so little gets actually done.
Right.
Like, what artifact have you actually made? You've just blown a lot of hot air about building culture.
Yeah, and we need to learn to think like craftsmen about whatever it is God has given us to do. Think like craftsmen. I mean, I'm a writer, so I spend a lot of time thinking like a craftsman, looking at great writers. I'm a screenwriter, so I watch movies like somebody who's trying to make them, right? I don't, the same way an architect goes into a building and says, I wonder how they did that. I wonder how they did that, right? It's beautiful. I love it. It's great. I watch movies just because they make me cry sometimes, but I never cease to watch them like a craftsman. I read screenplays. Screenplays aren't fun, but I'm a craftsman of screenplays. And so I read the best ones that I can find. And I study them. How did they do that? How do I imitate them? I've got my favorites that I go back to over and over. But because I want to be able to do that. I want to think like a craftsman about my craft. And that's, if you try to build culture, you're going to fail. You don't have it. You don't do. We are not creatures that do that. We're creatures.
So if we want Christian laws, we have to make Christian movies.
We have to make Christian movies, right?
Or
Christian,
TV.
write Christian poetry, make Christian music, but not the way. I mean, we're not really. Our musicians often don't think like craftsmen, right?
Right.
Yeah,
or they think of what they're doing as participating in the world's culture.
Yeah, and it's difficult because we are such an abstracted people.
Mm-hmm.
We are such the modern person is a ghost bouncing across the surface of the world. We spend as much time sitting in the balcony of our mind watching our lives as we do actually living, maybe more time watching our lives than actually living our lives, right? We are an abstracted people.
Yes.
And the culture is not built by abstracted people. Ghosts don't build culture. And we need to learn to we need to just beg the Lord to de-abstract us. There's a really great novel. Oh, you go ahead.
No, I want to hear about a really great novel. Hit me.
Yeah, it's called Love in the Ruins by Walker Percy.
Yes.
And it's about this bad Roman Catholic psychotherapist. I mean, bad in the sense that he's bad at being a Roman Catholic, and he knows it. But he's a psychotherapist who has invented a machine that can read the soul, and he just wanders around his town reading the soul of all these abstracted people. And there's this couple whose marriage is falling apart, and they've read every book about it. They've done all, and they're analyzing it, and they're looking at it from this way, looking at it from that way, and he says, "Oh, I think they've read more books about marriage than I have." Right? The counselor is saying this in his head, and what he tells them to do is, instead of driving home, to try and get across the swamp together, right? And so
yeah.
they have to get home through the swamp, which is full of poisonous snakes and alligators, and that, because he's like, they're so abstracted that they can't connect. They're like two ghosts floating in the same room, but a dose of reality is what they need.
Yeah, a dose of incarnation is what they need. I mean,
dose of bodily reality. Yeah.
Yeah. The balcony of the mind is a great phrase, and I don't know if it's yours, but it's an observable phenomenon by psychologists, and this is since at least the 80s and 90s. I remember reading about this in the 90s, and it's just only gotten worse since then. But who knows how old it is? But it seems like a very modern phenomenon, and it's this: we all, but particularly teenagers, are susceptible to imagining the camera on us.
Yes.
Right? Like we picture ourselves and how people are perceiving us. We're so abstracted, we're so ghostly that we view ourselves from a balcony, right?
Right.
We can't even live our own lives. And I have a hard time picturing a 17th century Englishman doing the same.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's what that is. What we don't understand is the effect. The reason that we can't even take 16th, 17th century laws and try and just say, well, that law was good, let's reinstate it, is because people now have been formed in a different context, and they're not going to interpret it the same way, right? You need and this is what Alfred was doing, is he was figuring out what is the substance of the of the Greek and Roman law tradition as it comes in to my context? What is the substance of the tribal law tradition as it comes into my context? How does the book of Deuteronomy enter into conversation with them? And how do we find the substance of it and then translate it into Anglo-Saxon, right? Which is what that's literally what he's doing, is he's translating into Anglo-Saxon and letting the book of Deuteronomy guide it, so that the truth of what just laws are can be applied to these people in this situation in a historically legal way.
Yes. And that's talking about, the law side of things. But, so we're basically, when we talk about theonomy and Reconstruction, the movements that they were a couple of decades ago, we're talking about people who just coin at least one pseudo-Greek word out of really nowhere, but they're nomadic instead of pneumatic. Let's go ahead and cater to that a little bit, but we'll make some transitional rules, some laws for the conquest of the world for Christ. I'll put out two, and I wonder if you'd like to add any. My laws for the conquest of the world for Christ are: have sex with your wife and celebrate Christmas. Would you like to add anything?
The one that I would add is preachers must stop preaching about the gospel and start preaching the gospel.
Oh, don't hurt anybody, Jason.
Okay. I think the heart of where the abstraction starts is in the pulpit. I mean, in terms of the Christian culture, right? And then secondarily, I think that marriages, the figuring out how to come together from a husband and a wife, figuring out how to come together from this context and this culture is hard. And there's nothing but the grace of God in the first place that can bring a man and a woman together in any context, because they're creatures that are so different. Chesterton says they are metals that are of such different quality that it takes the heat, all the heat of romance to meld them together, right? It's like it's already a hard process, but then add into that the abstractedness, the inability to. There's a really great book that I just read, The Body Keeps the Score, that's about trauma and the way that our mind and our body cease to interact well because of trauma, and how because we're so abstracted from our bodies, often we don't even realize that, but our bodies don't forget the trauma we've been through, and it's a really helpful book. There's all sorts of things, but we live in a world where so many of us have gone through some sort of trauma, and the only way through is to feel the grief of it, but we're so abstracted that we can't. A really good example of a story I just heard was, a divorce. Multiple years after a divorce, a wife finally telling, sort of declaring or telling people finally that she had gotten pregnant as a teenager and had to give the baby up for adoption, but she had kept it a secret her entire life, and her husband never knew. And 4 years after the divorce, she finally tells everybody, including calling her ex-husband and saying, "Look, I never told you this." And he's like, "That makes sense of everything. Can we try this again?" Right? So they start dating again. Neither of them married in between, so it's still legal to come back together. They end up coming back together and having a good marriage after. But it was the trauma had so separated this woman from herself, right? Had shattered her selfhood, shattered her sense that she couldn't have relationships, right?
And let's not forget that the word abstraction means removal. That's what abstraction is. It's removal. And
Right.
that makes me think of the people of God, because I mean we've been talking about the people of God effectively, and so if the body keeps the score, you know the people of God are the bride of Christ. We are a body,
Right.
and abstraction hurts us, hurts the body. We talk about culture. What about the body?
Right.
We have to live. We have to
Yeah.
live. And to live, we need sacrament and Christmas and all the things. We need
Yeah.
the things, the artifacts and the
Calendar
things to
and
live.
and we don't need some ideal calendar that we finally discover here is the actual perfect ideal church calendar, and now that we have it, we can begin living it together.
Right.
And right, we just need to just do things.
Yep.
Just like start with Sundays. Let's worship together and enjoy Sundays and have tea and martinis afterwards, and
Amen.
and just start with what you've got and walk in the Spirit. Take the next step in the Spirit and quit trying to get to the ideal before you start.
Yeah, just do things. Okay, so to close, I want to read a poem that I know you know and love, and it's the poem I always think of when I think about justice, and it's "As Kingfishers Catch Fire."
Oh, did you know that you were actually the one that introduced Gerard Manley Hopkins to me when I was 21 years old?
No.
Yeah.
That makes me shed a tear.
It changed my life. I mean, literally, I would not be who I am if it weren't for Gerard Manley Hopkins. And you put a copy of Gerard Manley Hopkins into my hand because you said something about Hopkins, and I said, who? You said Gerard Manley Hopkins. I said, oh, I've never read him. The next time we saw each other, you handed me a copy of Gerard Manley Hopkins, and it literally changed my life. I mean, yeah. So thank you,
dude.
Archie and Mehitabel and Gerard Manley Hopkins that you introduced me, and eternally grateful. Two of my favorites. So.
Well, that's very cool. All right, well, so now I have to focus on reading this poem without being carried away by sentimentality. Jason,
sentimentality is a gift from God.
As kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame. As tumbled over rim and roundy wells, stones ring, like each tucked string tells, each hung bell's bow swung finds tongue to fling out broad its name. Each mortal thing does one thing and the same, deals out that being indoors each one dwells. Selves goes itself, myself it speaks and spells, crying, what I do is me, for that I came. I say more, the just man justices. Keeps grace, that keeps all his goings graces. Acts in God's eye what in God's eye he is, Christ, for Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. Well, we've talked about some great men today.
We really have. That poem is. Can I read a poem that I wrote about something similar?
Yes.
It's called Raspberry Pie. Bent over raspberry pie, my tongue the taproot of my soul, gems jammed and canned, sounding themselves in the crushing, rushing to the world, sweetening the pie, glorifying snowmelt and sunshine, tiny sun-run harvesters, wide loads running row on row of wind, sweetening the spirit breath so it can samba down my taste buds, stomp the paso doble up the edges, the red cape of the bullfighter folding into the butterflaked crust, alabaster flask of raspberry juice, fork cracked to anoint the mouth's alleys, flow up the root system and feed my soul.
So what are we saying here? What we are saying is that the best thing is for all things and all men to be that which God wants them to be, that which God made them for. That is how we will get justice. Yeah. That is how we will get law.
For things to begin to selve, to be themselves, to sound like roundy wells and be
hot
themselves.
Stuff. Yes. That's our hour-long hot take. Self already.
Self. Go out and self.
I have absolutely just loved having this conversation. You know what's going to happen. I am now going to start regularly bugging you
Let's
show
do it.
up here and start talking with me.
I'm in. Let's do it.
Sweet. All right, so long, everybody.
All right.